Welcome back to a special NSP short for the month of remembrance. I'm your host, Chris Ayotte. I have my first return guest to the podcast. Steve MacBeth was featured on episode 9 and has come back to the show to discuss his newly released book, No Names, No Pack Drill. The book is a compilation of first-hand accounts from Afghanistan, but the stories are presented in a unique and compelling way. The foreword was written by the Honourable Peter Mackay, another NSP alum, and he captures the spirit of the book perfectly. Quote, "This book can be summed up as the truth for Canadians about what soldiers did in our name." End quote. Thanks for listening. Now here's my second conversation with Steve MacBeth. Steve, welcome back to the NSP. Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me on, Chris.
Now, for listeners, Steve MacBeth was episode 9 of the NSP. He lives down in New Zealand now, and we wanted to have an NSP short specifically to talk about his newly released book, No Names, No Pack Drill. And I think it's a great time to be able to spread the word on this book in November. As I mentioned previously in some social media posts, the focus this month is all about veteran content, and Steve, I think, has contributed significantly to the body of work around Afghanistan. Maybe I'll start, Steve, have you always wanted to write a book? Do you like writing? You're a prolific writer. I mean, how did the task of taking on something like this sort of sit with you?
No, I haven't always had a dream of writing a book. I've had to write professionally and I write academically, but I wouldn't say that I'm someone that has gone away to write specifically to entertain or for the purpose of really getting to that end result of wanting to publish a book. For me, I found as I left the Canadian Forces that our stories, those of us that have served in Afghanistan, were already starting to fade. And there was a body of work that was developing that were really good personal documentations of individual experiences in Afghanistan. There were command experiences that were laid out. And then, of course, there were the formal histories. And I always thought back to the times where we would gather as groups and we would share stories that maybe were the essence of what we had done. And I just kind of wanted to take an opportunity to capture those and to perhaps like lock them in somewhere so that they existed moving forward. And so it really kind of came about as a series of conversations that then I thought, I should put this together in some way and then hopefully capture our experiences of that time in history as Canadians that went to Afghanistan.
Now, for those who haven't heard your episode, maybe give us a little sense of the connection, your connection to Afghanistan.
So actually in the episode, we didn't really talk much about Afghanistan. And I always wondered if that was, on purpose or because I actually haven't talked about it a lot. So my own personal experiences, I've got a 25-year history in the Canadian Armed Forces. I served in the Princess Patricia Canadian Infantry as a private, and then I was selected to be an officer, and then I served in the Royal Canadian Regiment, which is the other English infantry regiment in Canada. During that time as an officer, Afghanistan was central to our peace, and I found myself deploying 3 times over 7 years to Afghanistan as a rifle platoon commander, and then as a reconnaissance platoon commander, and then finally as a advisor in the field with our Afghan partners down in Kandahar. And so I think for that during that time, we were either training for Afghanistan, recovering from Afghanistan, or training somebody else for Afghanistan. And so for that period of time between 2001 and 2014, that was central to anybody who was in the Army. That was central to our existence. And so I guess that would be our connection to that. And I found myself very much wanting to make sure that our the stories were carried through so that they could be reflected on in the future. I don't know, like right now, it's probably very familiar, but but probably 25 or 30 years from now, the day-to-day life of a Canadian soldier in Afghanistan will be less familiar, and maybe it will be useful.
Now, where do you even start an undertaking like this? Like, what is the process that you followed to pull these stories together and to get the book published?
First of all, there was a model. There are two models. One was Six Warriors by Barry Broadfoot. He's a Canadian author. I think he had a newspaper background. And this book, Six Warriors, is a collection from World War II that just pulls out extracts as he went across Canada to speak to Canadian veterans and civilians about their experiences on the Second World War. And the other one was a book by a guy named Mark Baker called NAM, where he interviewed, I believe, 150 or more Vietnam veterans and kind of broke down into very short stories. And so I looked at that and I thought that's a manageable model that will allow me to capture broadly the experiences of Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan, and then make it short enough that people could break it down into chunks. And if they read a page, they would get a story. If they read a chapter, they would get 15 stories. And so if you wanted to just read about something specific or read about a very specific experience, you could put the book away and you would have had something that you could take away from it. And so then the next step, once kind of like figuring out the model, is to think about who might want to share. And I put out a message to kind of Afghan vets. The majority of them are from the infantry, and they put in their interest in talking to me. And first of all, the trust that they demonstrated and their willingness to share their stories was overwhelming. And what I think the biggest thing is being able to then connect. And so I traveled across people that were still in the military, people that had gotten out of the military, people that lived all across Canada. And everywhere that I would go, whether it be for work or socially, I would connect with a different Afghan vet, and I would sit down and have sometimes a 40-minute conversation and sometimes a several-hour conversation about their experiences. And then I would record those conversations and then go through the transcription of them, and then would often share them back to make sure that I captured the right pieces. And then from there, I look to organize the book thematically to take the reader through a tour of duty in Afghanistan. And so after a short introduction, really focus on the stories and the soldiers, and have your introduction to, you wake up and you're going to Afghanistan. What did that feel like? And then you have to do all this training, and how the training changed, because in early 2000s, the training was as quick as making sure your passport was ready, you had your needles, and you got on your plane and went. To later on in the mission, the training really professionalized, and people were spending 7 or 8 months training, and then 7 or 8 months away to do that piece, and that changed. And then, of course, the movement through the deployment, first contact in Afghanistan, and then all the way through. And so building those themes out were really important, and then revising the book was really kind of the in-depth process. And it, frankly, was a lot of material. There was hundreds and hundreds of hours of interviews that had to be broken down into these bite-sized chunks so that I could hopefully share something useful back to the reader.
One of the things I really like about the book is how it's organized. I think that's from what books I've read, it's unique. So, I mean, is that one of the things that you think makes this different from other offerings, whether it be on Afghanistan or personal memoirs of war?
I do. I think there's a couple of things that maybe make it different. One, how it's organized, because like I said earlier, I think people can take elements out of it that they want. They can read the whole thing or a portion and still get something out of the book. The other piece would be that because it's no one's story, it's everyone's story. And what I've been told of people who have already read the book is that even if they had served at any point in Afghanistan, they can relate to the stories that are in there. And where if you have a personal memoir, it's really about you reflecting yourself back out. This is hopefully about reflecting a little bit of a collective experience back out, so that you can find a little piece of yourself, or have a little piece of, as a Canadian, reflect on any Canadian that served in Afghanistan. And there's all all types of Canadians contributed to this. And so I think that's probably a really unique part of the book.
Yeah, and maybe you can explain to the listener a little bit about the way it's organized in your approach and how that relates to the name of the book.
Right. So no names, no pack drill is a great saying. I think started in the UK Army, but adopted by almost all Commonwealth nations. And any good senior NCO, when speaking to leadership, there's an opportunity to say, listen, there's a lesson that has to be learned here. Something happened. We don't need to appropriate blame. We don't even need to attribute who it was, but we do need to listen to the story and understand the lesson that comes from it. And so it's almost like a disclaimer. Like, Chris, I'm going to tell you that something happened. No names, no pack drill is my disclaimer that I'm not going to tell you who it was, but I am going to tell you that it's important that you should listen to it. And then as a leader, you can do with it what you will. And I thought that was very fitting for the book to take that disclaimer up front. No names, no pack drill, and let everyone know that when you go into this book, these are about the perceptions of the soldiers that I interviewed on the ground at that moment, at that time, with the vision that they had. So they could be slightly imperfect, and it's important to note that it's not as important that it's a certain person at a certain time, but it is important that these type of events occurred and that we acknowledge them and that there are lessons to be taken from them. And it's great that we sit and kind of reflect on that time in Canadian history, because as we move forward, the individual will become less important and the group actions and the group perspective will become more important, I think.
How did you go about selecting the cover art for this, the cover photo?
So that photo was taken by a Vandu.
Royal 22nd Regiment, for those who don't know that.
Royal 22nd Regiment out of Quebec. And so we had an exchange officer, a great guy, and I'm allowed to use his name, so he's not a no names, no pack drill. I've asked permission. And he was this Captain Max Michaud Shields, had come to the 1st Battalion on exchange and had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with 1st Battalion. First as the reconnaissance platoon commander in Kabul, and then secondly as the 2IC of Bravo Company during Op Medusa. And as you can read in like Mark Gasparato's book, when Summit was just being built, there were combat roads that were pushed in, and there were these kind of 2 trails that developed. And that sign was stamped in by a couple of troops because as the advance occurred, it was kind of very controlled, and this is almost like a traffic control sign. But of course, Canadian soldiers, have a good sense of humor, and so that this way to the suck, no other way stupid, I think was a very Max snapped that photo, and it's kind of sat in various inboxes, I think, for years. And I always thought that was a very appropriate picture of the kind of humor of Canadian soldiers in a time of in a time of stress. Like, no matter how dark it is or what's going on, they'll find a way to kind of make it a bit light and is a true reflection of the spirit that's out there. And so I thought that was an appropriate cover for a reflection on Canadian soldiers' experiences.
So maybe I'll take that thread of stress, not stress in military operations, but I have heard some authors say previously, whether they are longtime authors or first-time authors, that writing a book was one of the hardest things that they'd ever done. I'm wondering for you, what was the sort of the lift for writing a book for the first time?
It was difficult. So from it was probably 4.5 years from start to finish, and once I had not expected the depth of response nor the breadth of response that I got, nor how engaged I became with each of the stories. And so the motivation really became a feeling of wanting to be responsible and wanting to be accountable to reflecting that trust that was given to me by the veterans that shared their stories. And so that was really the motivation overarchingly for this book and for the effort. And so it was a lot of kind of early mornings and late nights of working outside the margins of normal daily work and family and life to be able to put it together. And I hope that I represented their equity as well in the effort.
Now, as we said, it's been launched. Where can people find it?
So right now it can be found, I believe, in the notes. There'll be a Amazon link. And good news, like after maybe it's only a 24-hour success, but it's number one in Canadian history for this last 24 hours. So that's great. And I really hope that people enjoy or take the opportunity to pick it up and during this month of remembrance, get a chance to connect with the stories of our soldiers in Afghanistan.
And what are the intent for the use of the profits from the book?
So right now, like full disclosure, like I've got some costs that I have to cover, but after that, I'm in discussions with a charity for veterans homelessness. And what I'd like to see is that the profits from the book go towards veterans homelessness. And I think that would be as I understand it, it's a growing problem. And I've been amazed to see there's a couple of charities that are brick and mortar and actually building homes to help veterans get through those different stages of challenge. And I'm inspired by that type of work. And so if in some small way we can from this collective effort help that, I think that's a very appropriate use of whatever profits come out of the book.
Last word to you, Steve, before we wrap this up. If there's anything else you want to leave with the listener about this work and everything you've done to pull it together on behalf of the veteran community from Afghanistan.
First of all, I just want to again say thank you for having me on to give me a little bit of airtime to support the book, and two, a deep thank you and appreciation to the soldiers and trust that they showed in me to share their stories and now to get them out onto the street. And hopefully there's a positive engagement for everybody, and we're able to add a small piece to the larger discourse of the history of Afghanistan.
Amazing. Steve, thanks for continuing to be one of our Northern Sentinels, outstationed in New Zealand. Appreciate your time, and thank you so much for your work in putting this together.
Thank you very much, Chris.